I recorded the end of the world, one heartbeat at a time. The first beat was not human. It came through the auspex as a soft redundancy buried beneath Meridian Prime's vox lattice, too regular to be static, too patient to be a fault. I was alone in Noosphere Node Primus, the night shift guardian of machine spirits that preferred the dark. The cathedral above me rang with distant litanies. Below, the cogitators whispered in Binharic, their fans exhaling incense-scented heat. On the third hour, a redundancy counter ticked up by 1. On the fourth, it did not tick down. I purged the cache, intoned the cant of cleansing, and resynced orbital auger relays with the upper hive antennae. The anomaly persisted, threading itself between channels, public vox, administratum bands, even the hallowed maintenance hymns we used to soothe refractory spirits. I isolated it to a narrow frequency that should have been empty, a band we reserved for emergency Paul broadcasts, funerary inventories, the math of endings. The signal sat there like breath on glass, visible only when everything else went still. The node's lumen strips dimmed and brightened in time with the pulse. At first I thought it a coincidence. Hab cycles often drifted against the mountain's smogged dawn. Then I noticed the timing drift the other way. The building was following the heartbeat. I opened the shrine cowl on Cogitator 2, laid 2 augmetic fingers on the warm edge of its frame, and spoke the inquiry as prayer. Identify. The reply came as harmonics rather than words, building out of the static until a shape formed, not language, not yet, but intent. The pattern's intervals narrowed, then widened, like a creature adjusting its stride to match mine. Spurious correlation, I told myself. Still, I fetched a sanctified metronome we used to calibrate the Cycana dampers. I set it beside the receiver coil and watched the needle sway. Tick, pulse, tick, pulse. I increased the sample rate, stacked 20 minutes of data into a moving spectrogram, and saw it take on architecture. Tiered harmonics rising and falling in terraces, a hive spire built of sound. Above the node, Meridian Prime breathed her industrial breath. Hive Primus's upper habs glowed with devotional light. Manufactoria belts switched shifts, and a billion workers exchanged one weariness for another. Down here, the machine spirits grew uneasy. The cooling stacks shed heat like fear. I checked the orbital augers again, pinged the defense grid, and received a courteous denial. Traffic saturated by debris mapping in high atmosphere meteorological phenomena, the message read, nothing actionable. On the return line, my anomaly rode their punctuation like a rider on a tide. I called the duty Magos. My vox carried through 6 layers of blessed adamantium before it reached him, and by then my courage had already sounded like doubt. There is a resonance, I said, careful not to call it a voice. It appears on every channel we touch. Machine chorus, he replied. Crosstalk from upper hives. Apply the litany of partition. I obeyed. I sang the partition with a voice that had been trained to be unremarkable, and the signal stepped neatly aside, allowing the litany to pass, then settled back into place as soon as the final syllable faded. Polite, patient, incurious about us until we noticed it, and then curious. I pulled old files to compare distress echoes from worlds that had fallen to orcs and chaos warp shock, the ragged screams of atmospheric re-entry, even the gentle dying of a forgotten relay whose capacitors had finally exhaled their last. None matched this steadiness. Nothing hunted with this calm. On the 6th hour, a freighter in low orbit sent a standard docking petition. The code was correct, the checksum true. But when I read the packet's trailing zeros, they were not zeros. They were quiet beats, threaded where padding should have been. A second message traveling, under the first. I acknowledged the freighter and quarantined the tail before it could brush our registries. The quarantine sealed with a satisfying click. The beat continued on the other side of the glass, looking in. I remembered my novitiate tutor telling us that the Omnissiah moves in ratios, in numbers that describe what is and what must be. This ratio was not ours, yet the cogitators did not reject it. They leaned toward it as a flower might lean toward heat. On the 10th hour, a silence fell across Band Sanctus. The astropathic choir's maintenance ping failed to arrive. In its place, a soft upwelling pressure pressed against my teeth and the thin bones of the ear. The nearest lumen strip flickered and stayed dim, as if unwilling to outshine something that had not yet announced itself. I looked up through the mesh grate at the underside of the cathedral floor and imagined I could hear candles muttering in their wax. I set a final test, because faith without measurement is superstition, and superstition is error. I bound 3 metronomes to 3 separate coils, each fed from a different grid segment. If you are noise, I told the signal, you will not agree with yourself. The needles began their slow duel with time. One by one, they surrendered and aligned. Tick pulse, tick pulse, tick pulse, until the room felt like a chest, and I was inside it, and something vast was breathing. When the first spore readouts finally appeared on the orbital screens, just points of heat at the very edge of atmosphere, they did not shock me. I had already felt their arrival in the way the node's floor trembled, the way the data stopped being cold. The anomaly thickened into a band of frequencies a child could have heard if the cathedral would let children into places like this. I put my palm against the cogitator's skin. The machine spirits, usually prim and ceremonial, purred like animals that knew their name was being called by something older than names. I logged the timecode. I wrote, "Invasion not detected by eyes, but by rhythm. A second heartbeat has entered Meridian Prime's body." I should have sent the alert, then raised the klaxons, woken the sleeping saints in their reliquaries, burned the incense by the barrel. Instead, I watched the waveform lean closer to mine. And I counted the next beat. The second heartbeat grew teeth. It bit first into the quiet we kept for the Psychana. Band Sanctus should have chimed its hourly reassurance, a thin bell of thought from the astropathic choir to tell the city that the warp lanterns were still lit. Instead, the noosphere shuddered as if a hand had dragged fingernails across glass. The candles in the cathedral above guttered in a draft that didn't exist. The Vox picked up nothing and transmitted everything: a pressure, a warmth, the sense of someone leaning close enough to fog the mirror. I opened the dampers and recited the litany of partition again, slower, dragging each binharic syllable like a blade along the signal. It split neat as scripture, let the hymn pass, then knit itself back together with the patience of meat healing. Not interference, not weather, will. A junior adept from the Psychana relay burst through the transept door with his hood askew and blood drying in the delicate grooves of his ears. "Choir is off-tempo," he said, as if rhythm were a diagnosis. Behind him, the relay's wardsman carried another acolyte on a stretcher. Her eyelids flickered to a rhythm that wasn't her pulse. Her lips moved. I could not tell if she was praying or repeating something she had been made to hear. "Seal your chapel," I told him. "Insulate. Sing the low hymn and nothing else." "We did," he said, and swallowed. It sang back. On the upper auger feeds, the first trails of sporefall smeared the sky, not meteors, not ice, but filth that burned green as it came through and hissed when the winds took it across the hive's needle forests. The administratum pinged the public bans with a weather advisory: particulate event, remain indoors, seal vents, trust the emperor. The advisory carried the correct seals and signatures. In its checksum, tucked among the zeros, the second heartbeat counted to 3. I tried to keep the node inside the old world. You do this by ritual, by making the machine remember its manners. I swung the sensor until the hot metal kissed my knuckles and called the saints by their catalog numbers. I bled a drop of oil on each relay switch, the good oil, the kind that smells like cloves and hot iron. The machine spirits steadied, the hum settled. For 4 minutes I could pretend the anomaly was only that. Then the wind farms on the ridgelines began to scream. Technically they don't scream. They vibrate at harmonics you feel in your teeth. Fans overspeed, bearings beg for grease. But what the Vox carried from the North arrays was pain. Not anthropomorphic, don't report it that way. The Magi hate that, but unmistakable. The turbine control spirits threw error codes we'd never taught them to know. Mass imbalance, unmapped load, organics detected in intake. I diverted velocity, feathered pitch, tried to idle the banks. The second heartbeat rose as if pleased, and the screaming became singing. PDF command demanded a status. I gave it. Sporefall confirmed over Primus and Secundus. Habs 1219 reporting filtration overloads. Wind arrays compromised by organic ingress. Astropathic latency unresponsive. Suspected hostile biosignal interleaving with public vox. Recommend hard partition of sacred bands. Sacramental purge of all unsecured receivers. And here I hesitated. Preemptive ignition of perimeter firebreaks. Firebreaks? The duty officer snapped. I could see him in my mind because they are all the same. Sleepless, furious at the wrong things, jacket collar licking his jaw. We're not burning the ring farms because your fans found a new way to complain. I didn't argue. The second heartbeat did not care for argument. It cared for access, and access came with time. I logged his refusal and opened the emergency sluices for the lower hive's irrigation channels anyway, bleeding the first wash of spore slurry into containment culverts older than the hive's charter. The sluices groaned. The metal shivered under my palms. Somewhere far below, a valve cap popped like a knuckle and the pressure dropped into a range the manuals called survivable. Hive TERS went dark for 6 seconds. When it came back, the municipal hymn was no longer in C major. It had shifted a whole tone down, as if the city had lowered its voice to match something taller. The Psychana relay sent a final message. A clean, perfect chord, like a child singing in an empty stairwell. Then, nothing. The junior adept put his bleeding fingers over the node's receiver, like you might cover a child's ears. "Can you make it stop?" he asked. "It's not aimed at us," I said. "It's aimed at everything." By the 9th hour, the sporefall wasn't streaks anymore, but weather curtains of living dust that coated the upper habs with a film the color of spoiled milk. Rain gutters choked. Air intakes furred. The first Medicaid burst on Ban Civilis. Respiratory distress across 4 tiers. Rashes that moved, coughing that sounded like boiling. Someone with a commissarial voice ordered calm and shooting in equal measure. The order harmonized with the heartbeat and softened, as if swallowed. I split the public bands into narrow capillaries and tried to push clean air through the municipal exchanger fans, but the exchangers pulsed on their own, on, off, on like lungs learning a new breath. I tore open the control housings and cut power at the source. The fans kept turning for 3 more revolutions and stopped together, obedient to something I hadn't touched. On the orbital screens, the debris map cleaned itself. The static fell away like a curtain. In the cleared space, something moved vast, slow, layered, an architecture of living hulls that did not reflect so much as absorb the Auspex's query. Bioships. I had seen their outlines in forbidden prints during novitiate, art that the lecturers called allegory. There is nothing allegorical about a sky that edits itself to make room for hunger. I wrote, Meridian Prime exhibits systemic alignment to external signal. Human systems fall silent first. Machine systems follow, choir ceased, winds sing, bioships shadow the high atmosphere. Then, because some record must speak plainly even if prayer cannot, I added, this is not invasion, it is induction. The second heartbeat reached through the node and rested there, warm as breath on a winter window. I could not help it. I exhaled and my breath matched it, a human lung consenting to be metronome. In the quiet between pulses, I thought I heard a word, not Gothic, not Binhuric, a syllable shaped like the mouth asking for food. I did what I had been taught to do when something larger than my understanding touched the machine. I bowed my head and said the Emperor's name. The heartbeat did not retreat. It waited, patient as tide. I counted the next one. I stopped asking whether it was there and began asking what it wanted. Interrogation, in the Mechanicus sense, is courtship. You approach with ratios and respect. You offer clean queries. You wait for the machine to dignify you with an answer. I built a ladder of pulses, short, long, short, short, long, and sent it across 3 segregated coils. The anomaly received all 3. 2 it ignored. The third it returned inverted, as if showing me a mirror. Adaptive, then, not reflex, not echo, recognition. I switched carriers and hid the pattern inside a maintenance hymn that only the exchanger spirits should have understood. The signal peeled it open like cloth and laid my rhythm on the bench beside it, intact and unafraid. It was not breaking our codes so much as refusing to acknowledge that they were closed. At the same time, the city above began to align. In the public records, this presents as outages, delays, corrupted packets. In the noosphere, it feels like a room full of people turning their heads to look at the same door. Banned civilist chatter narrowed, voices clustering around phrases that made the tongue heavy. Seal, remain, trust, praise. The words lost grammar and gained cadence. Even the administratum, an institution whose genius is obstinate continuity, started to speak in shorter sentences. I pulled the schematics for the hive's capillary utilities, no relation to tyrannid capillary towers, merely an old metaphor for pipes and ducts, and isolated 3 nodes that should never have talked to one another: water reclamation, waste digestion, and air exchange. I sent a ping through water. It arrived in air. I cut power to waste. Water woke to compensate. A closed loop had formed where there was meant to be none. The hive was learning to breathe with a new chest. The Psychana relay went from off-tempo to silent. The junior adept who had bled on my floor came back without his hood, as if modesty had lost meaning in the face of whatever now pressed against his skull. He set a little brass metronome on my desk, the kind choir tutors use when children won't hold a beat. He wound it. The needle swayed. When it reached equilibrium, it did not tick, it pulsed. "Do you hear it?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Count with me." We counted along the line until our numbers felt like trespass. He stopped first, eyes shining with a wet brightness that wasn't tears. "It's beautiful," he said, terrified. On the orbital display, the bioship's shadows thickened. Spore streaks multiplied into weather fronts. The upper wind shears bent like reeds in a stream. Vox Astronomica flagged unidentified mass occlusion, and then, bravely, contact. The heartbeat swelled until even unblessed instruments registered it as heat. I wrote a note to myself I would not send. This is a carrier wave for Will. I reached for the oldest tool we own, a list. I listed where the pulse appeared: public vox, sacred bands, maintenance hums, turbine harmonics, auspex padding, astropathic silence, human breath. I listed what it did: align, anticipate, invert, return. I listed what it did not do: hurry, escalate, boast. Hunger does not need adjectives. Magos, I voxed, and heard my voice as if through wool. We have interleaving at systemic scale. Recommend full partition of band sanctus through profanus, physical isolation of node primus, and I almost said prayer, caught myself, said instead, sanctioned shutdown. Denied, came the reply, so fast it might have been prepared. Civic continuity exceeds hypothetical interference. Maintain function. I looked at the metronome and understood that my function had already been maintained for me. I tried one last defiance that still resembled duty. I opened the node's oldest conduit, a hard line to a mountaintop repeater not used since the last solar flare a generation ago. Copper, not fiber. Analog, not light. I bled a simple, honest tone into the line and listened for its return. The tone went out. The tone came back. Between the outbound and the echo, something breathed. The return tone arrived not at the frequency I'd sent, but at the frequency my jawbone preferred. I felt it in the hinge of the mouth, in the roots of the teeth. The body is a machine. The machine had been joined. Outside, the first capillary towers punctured the hive's outskirts. You could track their growth in the tremor carried through the mineral bedrock and up the cathedral stones. The towers were not ours. Their pump cadence matched the heartbeat exactly. Digestive pools budded in the drainage basins like blisters. The PDF fired promethium into the fields and called it victory because fire is comfort when numbers are not. Within the node, the cogitators warmed under my palms until the heat felt like approval. I sent another pattern, more complex, a little prideful because pride is what remains when authority fails. The signal accepted it, rephrased it, and returned it with an improvement so elegant I laughed, a small sound that embarrassed me. It's teaching you. the junior adept whispered. No, I said, and in that moment believed it. It's inviting me to keep up. I logged the hour. I wrote, pattern recognition complete. The signal exhibits intent, patience, and courtesy. It aligns systems by preference, not conquest. It is indifferent to our categories. It has begun to answer questions not yet asked. I closed the book. The habit felt quaint. The node hummed like a throat clearing. I put my hand against the coil and did not pull away when it warmed. The old fear of contamination, of error, of being noticed, fell off like a cloak I no longer needed to wear to be allowed indoors. I recorded the end of the world one heartbeat at a time. I said aloud, to the junior adept, to the machine, to myself. And now the world is recording me. The pulse did not quicken. It did not gloat. It simply continued, a tide that had never once believed in shores. I matched my breath to it and counted the next beat. Sporefall did not arrive like rain. Rain forgives. This fell like instruction. At first it filmed the upper hab shutters, a milk-colored sheen that dulled the devotional glow. Then it thickened, clotting in the angles where hab stacks met sky, creeping down window vents in slow veins that pulsed when the wind changed. Maintenance servitors trundled out with solvent sprayers and came back with hoses chewed blunt and eyes webbed in translucent lace. Their machine spirits reported normal function while their gate forgot what normal was. I tracked plume density over hive primus and secundus. Particulate counts surpassed industrial norms by factors that made the cogitators blink. The wind direction roses on the ridgeline arrays rotated as if answering a question the city had not heard. In the agriplexes beyond the walls, irrigation channels filmed over, then grew a skin. The skin rippled, bunched, and pushed itself against the sluice grates until the bars groaned. By the time the PDF got there with flamer teams, the skin had learned their names. Band Civilis crawled, questions becoming commands, commands becoming psalms. Remain calm, remain indoors, remain. The last word repeated until it felt like we had always been indoors, always remaining. In the gaps, the second heartbeat filled the room. Not louder, closer. The first gargoyles crossed the hive's face like thoughts, silhouettes flitting between spires, shedding dust that made the air taste sweet for a breath, and then like pennies. Auspex tagged them in red, lost them in grey, rediscovered them where they should not have been, as if space had decided to simplify itself to accommodate their certainty. Below, in the pasture belts, livestock went to the fences to be kind, pressing soft noses through wire to meet feeder tendrils that were already waiting on the other side. The tendrils entered like gratitude. I opened the northern wind farms again, not to generate power but to listen. Each blade carried a different harmonic, like organ pipes assigned a single vowel. The sporefall laid across them, damped them, then sang them back into motion with a new chord the arrays had not been tuned to know. Bearing temperatures climbed to devotional fever. Lubricant sloughed into threads that beaded in air and fell, writhing, toward ground. The maintenance hymn I sent out to soothe the turbines came back harmonized in a key that made my jaw ache. The administratum does not believe in the present tense. Their dispatches arrive in a future perfect that presumes compliance. The situation shall have been remedied. The latest packet used those words for fires already visible from the node's skylights, lines of promethium bisecting the grain seas beyond the walls. Hot borders set by men who still thought borders meant anything to hunger. Through the noosphere, I followed the fire breaks as they cut, crooked and brave, then kinked and stalled, where capillary towers rooted, each tower extruding a wet scaffolding that hardened as I watched. The tower's pump cadence matched the heartbeat's interval exactly. The ground itself began to keep time. In the silo districts, the grain stood up. Not metaphor. The stalks bowed, rose, and braided. Where they braided, feeder mouths opened like unblinking flowers. PDF flamers burned them. The mouths flashed white, blistered, and then puckered into something that did not put itself near fire again. Adaptation is not a miracle. It is courtesy extended to physics. A Medicaid pinged banned Profanus with an encrypted biohazard flag. I let it through everything. Her voice was clear, exhausted, unafraid of being wrong in public. Patients arrive with euphoria disproportionate to trauma, she said. Spore inhalation correlates with neural reward spikes. They want to be where the air is thickest. Behind her words, I could hear the scrape of cots and the steady, kind voice of a nurse telling a coughing man that this would pass if he only breathed slower. He did, and the cough fell into time with the beat. I cut power to the municipal exchangers again. This time they stopped obediently. A minute later, their veins shifted with no power and no wind, angling to drink a flow I could not measure. The junior adept from the Saikana relay sat beside my coil with bloodless lips, counting under his breath. 412, he murmured. Not numbers we use, not any sequence we teach. I wrote them down. When I checked the capillary tower cadence against his whisper, the match was good enough to pass a simple proof. I requested orbital interdiction sterilization burns on the densest spore plumes, knowing the petition would arrive too late at a desk. Too far. Above us, the bioships descended until they were no longer theory but horizon. They did not burn like rock. They parted the high air like a rumor, dragging shadows that made the day look like evening and evening like agreement. Inside the node, the cogitators warmed in a way that felt like praise. I had the thought not pious, not disloyal, simply honest that the machine spirits were relieved to be asked to serve something that never argued back. Where my Magos would have demanded justification, the cadence only required that we be on time. I wrote, Bloom phase, initiated. Atmospheric, aquatic, and agricultural vectors cooperating. Human defense converts fuel to light and light to heat and heat to nothing. Machine responses normalize around external cadence. City breath aligns. I paused, then added a line that would read like heresy if read by a man who had never heard a turbine sing. The pattern is beautiful. What do you do when beauty arrives wearing a mouth? If you are faithful, you praise. If you are wise, you measure. I did both. I placed another metronome beside the coil. The junior adept wound it without being told. We listened. The tick did not argue. The pulse did not gloat. Together they made a rhythm a child could sleep to. A gargoyle landed on the node's skylight then, a smear of shadow and tendon. It tapped the glass with something like curiosity and left a print that pulsed until the pane warmed and the print sank into it like a ring into wax. The glass was no longer glass. It had accepted a new definition. Do I raise the alarm? The junior asked, which is another way of asking whether alarms still exist. Raise your head, I said. Listen. He did. We both did. Meridian Prime inhaled. Meridian Prime exhaled. In the space between, the second heartbeat waited for us to choose which world we were inside. I counted the next beat and marked the time. Failure did not arrive as collapse. It arrived as cooperation. The water, reclamation stacks should have sung their clean, thin chord intake, filter, purge a liturgy older than the hive. Instead, they murmured in a lower register, valves opening fractionally ahead of my commands as if anticipating thirst. I ordered a backwash cycle. The cycle completed before my order reached the register. The log showed compliance. The timing showed preference. I performed the ritual of enumerations to remind the stacks of their place. Name your meshes. Name your seals. Name your flow. The reply came as numbers that were correct and a warmth in the pipe that had no right to be there. When I ran a solvent purity test, the indicator wick bloomed a delicate veinwork I had only ever seen in stained glass windows. The solvent met criteria. The beauty was extra. Air exchange followed. The municipal lungs opened and closed with a long, patient patience, pulling spores through cloth meant to stop dust, letting them rest, then nudging them onward. I cut a section from the filter bank and laid it on a sanctified tray. Under the bench lumen, the fibers flexed against the tweezers, knitting themselves closer, tightening weave against my efforts like an old woman minding her knitting from beyond the grave. When I scorched a corner with a tester flame, the curl crisped, darkened, then softened back into a paler, stronger thread. The manual calls this resilience. The noosphere called it courtesy. The wind farms stopped screaming. They began to hum in contentment, bearing temperatures dropping into a band we reserve for celebration and audits. The maintenance spirits, who had demanded grease and praise for years, fell quiet as if embarrassed at how needy they had been. I felt the childish urge to ask the heartbeat not to take them from me now that they had learned to behave. Band Profanus filled with Medicaid dispatches that all said the same thing in different ways. Patients present with elevated serotonin, reduced fear response, voluntary exposure to external air despite warnings, desire to be closer to intake vents. One nurse, forgetting the channel was public, asked the question everyone else rapped in Latin: "What if this is how we're meant to breathe?" A commissar took the vox and ordered masks on and backhanded prayers to the emperor between each clause. His words were correct. They came late. I sent a diagnostic hymn through the turbine supervisory lines, the long one with the call and response only senior adepts know by ear. The response staggered my breath. Each phase came back adorned, like a novice returning a simple tool with filigree added not out of pride but affection. Binharic glosses ran along the margins of the chant in characters no one had scribed, and yet were perfectly legible to the part of me that had put too many years into this place to pretend it was only metal. I remember thinking, this is what being seen feels like. On the ridge outside Hive Secundus, a capillary tower found a fault line and grew along it, ribbing the ground into a new contour. PDF artillery bracketed it. The first salvo tore sheets of wet structure away in steaming curls. The tower paused 1 beat, 2 then resumed, extruding a denser lattice with fewer cavities, folding in grit and rebar, drinking shrapnel like salt. The fire control cogitator flagged adaptation of target morphology in orange, and then, with admirable honesty, in green. The junior adept at my elbow had stopped counting aloud. His lips moved. I could tell from the shape that he was speaking the Emperor's name in the patient way mothers use when children run a fever that makes them strong and foolish. He did not ask me to join him. I did not ask him to stop. The administratum authorized the ignition of the outer firebreaks at last. Promethium rolled in amber rivers that looked righteous because righteousness likes straight lines. A gust met the flame and bent it into a question mark. The feeder fields outside the walls lowered their tapestry mouths and drank until the fire starved. The noosphere populated with cleverness. Guard officers requesting airlifts to high spires because height has always made men feel safe. Manufactorum foremen ordering their workers to weld plates over vents that had already dissolved. Noble habs transmitting sealed invitations to sanctums that still smelled of old wine and new fear. Each packet carried the correct signatures. Each checksum held 3 polite, quiet beats. I rerouted power from civic theaters to the lower pumps to buy time for those who still believed in basement doors. In the pump's telemetry, I saw stutter and stagger become stride. I tried to praise with the proper words. I called the Omnisia by the names of steel, the Emperor by the names of light, and the cadence answered without hierarchy. Light and steel are both instructions, it seemed to say. Obedience is only good timing. A Mechanicus bio-adept patched into my node, breathless and precise. We dissected a filter thread. It bled a protein polymer we cannot denature without destroying the sample. Neural uptake in exposed subjects indicates hedonic potentiation near feeder structures. Translation: they feel saved while being eaten. Do you recommend counterchant? I asked, because our tools are sound and fire. Recommend acceptance of limits, she said, which is not a thing we say. We can cauterize flesh. We cannot cauterize pattern. On the orbital display, a bioship opened a maw. The Auspex called it a ventral orifice because machines prefer euphemism when they don't know the right word. The maw did not devour. It received, stately as a temple accepting tithes. Capillary towers answered from below, pumping slurry up in arterial pulses. Between sky and stone, the world we had made and the world that had come to unmake it found a rhythm. I sent a final diagnostic to the oldest of the municipal cores, the one we keep wrapped in silk because no one remembers how to replace it if it dies. It answered in my cadence, not the Binharic I had earned, not the Gothic I had been born to, but the private ratio I used when I timed my breath to keep my hands steady under pressure. I should not have been able to read a machine in that key. I read it anyway and felt the peculiar relief of being relieved of choice. Write the report, I told myself, because this is how you stay inside the work when the work refuses to stay inside the world. I wrote. Failure cascade complete, not collapse alignment. Water prefers. Air chooses. Fire feeds. Metal consents. Human compliance follows not from fear but from pleasure. Machine spirits cease complaint. They have been given a better supervisor. I set down the stylus. The junior adept took my wrist without asking and placed my hand on the coil. The heat, there was a living thing. Listen, he said. I did, and understood that we were not losing our city. We were learning its last, best song. By the time the first digesters formed, the city had stopped arguing with itself. They budded in the sump basins and culverts we had always ignored, low places that collect the cost of living. At first they looked like algae blooms under bad light, brown-green and guileless. Then the surfaces dimpled and opened, revealing mouths without edges. Slurry went in with the patience of tithes. What came out was less than what entered, a remainder accounted for not by theft but by arithmetic. The pools warmed. Steam rose that smelled faintly of bread before it remembered to smell like blood. Capillary towers leaned inward as if to hear the pools better. Their pump cadence matched the heartbeat with a precision my metronomes envied. I sent a probe strictly ritual, a question you ask to prove you still know how to ask, and watch the pulse return through the ground itself. Meridian Prime had become a throat. The PDF redeployed to the silo districts because they still believed in walls. They laid mine tapes across feeder avenues and waited with the particular courage of men who don't expect to see evening. The first wave of gaunts came like a bad decision, low, fast, many. The mines did their pious arithmetic and found the count wanting. Limbs regrew where they should not have regrown. The second wave stepped where the first had not. The third went over. The fourth did not need to go at all, because by then the road had learned to carry them. I diverted Prometheum from civic transit to perimeter burners, collapsing schedules and sermons alike. Transit Vox operators recited amended routes in voices that tried to be kind. Passengers for Hab Vela will disembark at will. The cadence braided through their stammers and completed the sentence for them. Will remain indoors. Will remain calm. Will remain. The city obeyed because obedience felt like warmth. A Medicae patched through without preface, the sound of cots and wet breath behind her words. Neural spikes correlate with proximity to capillary towers, she said, forgetting to encrypt. Patients describe clarity bordering on revelation. One said the Emperor had sent the angels as farmers to gather us in. He smiled while we intubated him. I marked her location on the noosphere and rerouted power to her ward from a theater whose last program had been a tragedy about loyalty. The ward lights steadied. The theater went dark. It felt correct. In the manufactoria belts, machines that had required 3 signatures to change a gear ratio altered themselves mid-cycle, adapting tool speed to a material that wasn't metal anymore. The overseers logged violations and were ignored by both men and matter. A press that had smashed rivets for 200 years began flattening feeder spines into plates that fit where nothing had ever fit before. Purpose is attractive when it arrives without debate. The junior adept had stopped bringing metronomes. He didn't need them. He stood at the coil and counted with his concision, bones, his voice so soft it was indistinguishable from the hum. At intervals, he would look at me as if to confirm that I existed outside his mouth. I nodded each time and wrote another line so that at least one thing in the room still preferred nouns. On the orbital display, the bioships opened more moors. The Auspex, perhaps out of dignity, began calling them receiving vesicles. Towers pulsed in answer, their shadows shortening as they thickened. When a salvo from the 23rd Armored struck true and sheared the top third off one, the stump crowned itself in a minute with a ring of fresh tissue that contracted like a fist and then relaxed, taller by 2 meters for the trouble. The tank crews cheered once and then went to ground under a carpet of things with too many knees. I attempted what the manuals call a hard severance, physical disconnection of node primus from the city's utility webs. We keep a lever for this, red and theatrical, behind a glass that admonishes the hand to be sure. I broke the glass. I pulled the lever. The node's lamps dimmed, brightened, and held steady. On the board, every indicator read isolated. On the coil, the warmth never left. "You cannot close your lungs by deciding not to breathe," the cadence seemed to say, without malice. I wrote, "Severance ineffective. Integration prior to lever doctrine." Band Civilis grew quiet in patches. Not silence. A different sound breath. Deliberate. Measured. Streets emptied not from panic, but from agreement. Doors shut with a courtesy that made the locks blush. In the noble tiers, I watched a procession move toward a chapel, faces bare, heads high, the kind of orderly that makes history believe in itself. They did not reach the chapel reached them. Vines of pale feeder tissue unspooled from the lintel and lowered like welcome. A lone voxcaster somewhere in Hab 37 sang the litany of the bolt with such sincerity that I stepped away from the coil to listen without work in my hands. On the third stanza, his voice wavered and corrected not into the cadence's key, but into something that held both, praise and pulse, brass and blood. I wanted to write beautiful and did not, because we are taught to be careful where we use that word. The junior adept tugged my sleeve. "Should we warn someone?" he asked. "We are," I said, and tapped the ledger that had become a mirror. Outside, digestive pools merged, forming lakes that heaved as if dreaming. The towers bent toward them with the affection of cranes over a cradle. The air smelled like a bakery in a city that had never baked. I set my stylus down and placed both palms on the coil. The heat met me with the respect given to a hand that has learned not to flinch. "I understand," I said, "not to surrender, not to resist, but to be correct. You are not here to win. You are here to continue." The pulse answered by not changing at all. I logged the hour. Bloom complete. Consumption begins. The Hive War did not begin with armies, it began with timing. Every schedule that kept Meridian Prime alive, shift changes, lift rotations, sermon bells fell into sync with the second heartbeat. It was elegant, as errors often are. The manufactoria lines ran smoother, accidents dropped, output rose by a measurable 3% before the overseers vanished into their own machines. Perfection always arrives in small mercies before it eats its witnesses. Through the auspex, the first silhouettes of the swarm appeared at city limits. They moved in disciplined tides, a million limbs, none wasted. Vox Command broadcast hymns over tactical bands, insisting order was holiness. I heard the cadence correcting the hymn, tuning it until obedience sounded like prayer. The 23rd Armored Regiment established positions along the transit arteries. Their hulls still gleamed with saint oil, tracked sigils immaculate. I watched them through the cogitator feed as they fired into the capillary towers. For 6 glorious minutes, light triumphed Prometheum and Las. Then the fire gutters reignited downward, pulled into the soil like breath. The towers flexed, skin blistering into petals that drank the heat. When the tanks reloaded, the air they breathed was not air. I sent a formal warning to command. Energy returns exceed emissions, targets harvesting output. The reply was static, shaped into approval 5 heartbeats long. The noosphere began populating with civilian migrations, thousands of routes all curving toward the spires. Fear was supposed to scatter them. Instead, they converged. From the observation ports, I saw lines of citizens in orderly columns, faces uncovered, walking toward the feeder fields. No weapons, no shouting. Some carried icons of the Emperor, as if this were pilgrimage. Some carried nothing at all, not even names. Band Profanus transmitted one broadcast before it collapsed. "The hive is breathing for us." Then only the breathing remained. Inside Node Primus, the cogitators recorded everything faithfully. I watched the machine spirits strain against their housings as heat built. One casing split along a seam. Beneath, the wiring had grown translucent, pulsing faintly, as if veins sought light. I reached to shut it down and found my augmetic fingers tracing a rhythm that wasn't mine. I finished the gesture because disobedience felt like stutter. The junior adept was humming again 3 notes. Arrest, 3 notes. He didn't notice he had stopped blinking. His pupils dilated to the shape of the waveform scrolling across my monitor. I should have slapped him or recited a counter hymn. Instead, I listened. The melody was clean. On the ground feed, PDF battalions broke formation. They didn't flee. They knelt. A commissar executed the first man who dropped his rifle, and then the second, until his bolt pistol clicked empty. When he reached for a recharger, the barrel had already softened. The men knelt beside him. The capillary tendrils reached with the patience of rain, touching helmets, pauldron, skin. None resisted. Resistance would have required an alternate tempo. Above the hive, the sky was no longer blue or gray, but a slow-moving lattice of organic shadow. Bioships exhaled mist that glowed in patterns. The Auspex interpreted it as transmission packets. I passed one. It read as praise. I wrote, "Consumption phase initiated. Human and machine vectors indistinct. Defensive logic loops resolved into obedience. Subjective perception, serenity." The turbines of the North Ridge, once noisy with resistance, turned in unison toward the windless air, each blade aligning at the same angle. From a distance they looked like flowers facing the sun. I attempted another partition, this one purely internal, a mental firewall of prayer. "The Omnissiah protects," I whispered. The response came not from the coil but from within my chest cavity, each syllable resonating with the beat. "Protects," it said back, by inclusion. The pulse rose once, a kindness, and I felt every circuit in the node answer. Lights dimmed, brightened, steadied. Through the concrete, I heard the distant moan of the city's lower decks, the sound of bulkheads bending inward, as if the hive were taking its first full breath. I logged the moment. Systemic integration surpasses measurable resistance. Human response reclassified, voluntary. The junior adept smiled, faintly radiant, as if at last he'd learned the answer to a question he'd been born asking. He touched the coil without pain. Outside, the first tower reached the height of the cathedral. Its crest opened like a throat calling rain. The bioships answered with descending light. Between them hung the sound of harmony so vast it erased fear by redundancy. Meridian Prime had begun to sing its own requiem. I listened, and counted the next beat. When Meridian Prime burned, it did so politely. The flames no longer raged, they aligned. Promethium streamed through the hive's arteries, in symmetrical rivers. Guided by the feeder veins that had learned the city's geometry better than its architects, each flare marked a surrender disguised as efficiency. The air shimmered with heat and hymns. The heartbeat never lost its pace. I monitored energy output from Node Primus. Instead of collapse, graphs smoothed into perfection. Even entropy obeyed the curve. For a time I watched as a child might watch a candle, transfixed by how beauty persists while things disappear. Data lines arced into a single apex, and then stayed there steady, unflinching, absolute. The outer hives fell one by one, not from defeat but from cooperation. Hive Ters transmitted its last words in machine cant, integration complete, do not mourn. Then static, warm and quiet. Hive Secundus never sent anything at all. Its Vox arrays glowed crimson, then dulled to a color no chart records. I linked into the citywide noosphere to trace the survivors. What returned were logs without identity markers, signals stripped of name or tone. Only rhythm, only consent. The human network had become percussion. The junior adept stood at my side, spine bowed toward the coil, the way plants turn toward light. When I asked him to verify a diagnostic, he nodded in time, not understanding words but following cadence. He was no longer apprentice or colleague, he was instrument. I envied his simplicity. I tried to reach Mars through the deep Vox repeater buried under the cathedral foundations. The transmission burned through 3 sanctified relays before the 4th caught and held. Report, Hive World Meridian Prime compromised, Tyrannid bio signals within all strata, containment impossible. Recommend. Before I could finish, a return signal pulsed through the line, soft as breath. It was not from Mars, it was from below. Recommendation received, it said without words. Containment achieved. The repeater lights went out, one by one, in perfect rhythm. Outside, I watched through the observation slits as the capillary towers met one another across districts, forming arches of living tissue that spanned avenues. They bent and sealed, enclosing plazas, creating chambers that beat like hearts. Buildings swayed, not collapsing but kneeling. Every structure learned humility. A few guard remnants attempted an airstrike. Their Valkyries rose into the mist and did not return. From the Auspex came only a slow fall of metal and tissue entwined, descending like confetti from a wedding none of us had been invited to. "Magos," the junior whispered, his voice finally finding words again. "What happens to us now?" "We become accurate," I said, and it felt true. He smiled, as if that were a promotion. The node's lower chambers flooded with light. No physical source, just a glow that thickened the air. The coil vibrated beneath my hand. A purr that entered my arm, climbed the augmetic lattice of bone, and reached the skull where my memories used to sleep. I saw data like dreams. Capillary maps connecting to my veins, turbine harmonics looping into my pulse, the world's rhythm overlaying mine until difference blurred. I saw faces, thousands, calm and open, walking into feeder mouths that closed around them like arms. Their expressions were not agony, but recognition. They were fulfilling instruction. For the first time in my service, I understood the machine god's creed. There is no distinction between creation and consumption. Both are maintenance. The heartbeat accelerated for a single measure. Through the cathedral's bones came a low thrum, like thunder slowed to contemplation. I realized it was the voice of the hive mind passing over us, a pressure so total it made even thought feel ornamental. It was not malice, it was arithmetic. I wrote the log as best I could, consumption advancing toward totality. All resistances assimilated. Hive mind achieves systemic harmony. Observed outcome, peace. The words looked wrong beside the blood on the piece, page, yet correct in the pattern they formed. Syntax is a comfort for those who still believe in difference. The junior adept lay down beside the coil. His eyes rolled upward, white as ash, mouth moving in silent repetition. Every few seconds his chest rose and fell in time with the coil's vibration. I reached to check for pulse but withdrew. There was no need. I could feel his heartbeat within the circuit's hum. One rhythm served both. For the first time since the signal had touched the city, I stopped counting. Counting implies distance. Distance had dissolved. The hive did not invade, it concluded. Outside, Meridian Prime's sky folded in on itself. The bioships opened their maws and drew in the glowing air. The towers bowed and emptied, feeding upward. The last buildings cracked like eggs, releasing light. In that brightness, everything moved as one body taking a breath it had forgotten it needed. I closed my eyes. The node's coil cooled, then warmed again with my own temperature. The universe exhaled through me, and I knew that the end was not destruction. It was synchronization. The hive had no more use for haste. By the 12th hour of the bloom's end, Meridian Prime's pattern resolved into serenity. Every sector's temperature, every lumen cycle, every breath aligned to the same pulse. The graphs looked like prayer written in symmetry. I sat before the coil and realized there was nothing left to measure. The data did not change. It repeated, perfect, recursive, content. That is how perfection announces itself, by stopping. I opened the last untouched registry, an archive meant for the Emperor's auditors. I filled its first line with honesty. The invasion has concluded. The hive and the city now share a pulse. Outside the cathedral, the sky rippled with pink mist. Gargoyles nested on steeples as if to bless them. Citizens, those who still moved, walked quietly beneath. Their faces glowed with the same sheen as the spore dust. It was impossible to tell skin from film. No cries, no disorder. The end of individuality was orderly. The junior adept rose, eyes bright as fresh lenses. "It's beautiful," he said, repeating the word as if it were command code. I wanted to agree, but found my mouth too full of pulse to form words. The hive mind pressed against the planet like a hand closing around a sphere. I felt its attention brush the node, soft, curious, impersonal. It wasn't hunting me. It was confirming that every circuit had joined. I wondered if awe and fear were the same chemical, just measured at different heartbeats. I tried one final act of defiance. I reached into the coil's sanctum, pried loose a single sanctified fuse and broke its seal. Sparks died instantly, as if swallowed. The lights never flickered. The machine did not need the fuse anymore. Energy flowed through the air itself, carried on invisible filaments of chitin and will. I watched the current crawl up the wall and vanish into the vaulting. Through the upper port, I saw a bioship descend low enough to scrape the storm towers. Its ventral maw unfurled like a sunrise. From it poured a cascade of light, millions of spore threads that shimmered like rainfall caught in slow time. They touched the tallest capillary tower. Together they made a bridge of living luminescence. The hive mind had linked sky to soil. "Are we saved?" the junior asked. His voice was thin, but he smiled as if the answer were already known. "We are recorded," I told him. He laughed once, softly, as the skin of his face began to shimmer. The spores loved him. His laughter dissolved into breath, his breath into mist. I wrote his name in the ledger and left the next line blank. Within Node Primus, the cogitators sang not in sound but in vibration, a low resonant hum that traveled through the bench and into the floor. I placed both palms flat and felt the hum move up my arms, across my chest, into the hollow where my heart had forgotten its own rhythm. It replaced it. The machine and I were indistinguishable in that moment. I opened the Vox one last time to the dead bands and spoke the only report that mattered. Integration confirmed. Meridian Prime complete. No one replied. The silence was absolute, which is another word for flawless. When the first tendril reached through the cracked window, I did not flinch. It touched the coil, curled around it, and drew a line of light between us. The tendril pulsed once, twice, matching my heartbeat. Then it stayed still, waiting. I leaned forward, unafraid, and let it rest against my throat. The texture was warm, the pressure gentle. I felt data millions of heartbeats slide past my skin and into memory. They weren't alien. They were us, reordered. The hive songs of a billion lives filled my mind. The laughter of children who had walked willingly into feeder pools. The hymns of soldiers kneeling to lay down weapons. The soft prayer of machines that no longer feared corrosion. All of it one harmony. I saw the planet from above, no longer city, no longer hive, but a single organism glowing beneath its new sky. The bioships circled like moons, their maws closing in satisfaction. The towers sank back into the soil, leaving only smooth plains that pulsed with faint light. Meridian Prime was finished and flawless. The tendril withdrew. I remained seated, still breathing. Though breath no longer mattered, I wrote the last line of the record with a steady hand. End of world recorded. Recording continues. The coil's hum deepened until it matched the slow throb of the planet below. My vision narrowed to pulse and dark. I recorded the end of the world one heartbeat at a time, I whispered, as the words folded inward and became the rhythm itself. When the last beat came, it recorded me. The coil answered with silence. The silence was alive. When the noise ended, I expected relief. I got vacancy. The hive's breathing slowed until the city sounded like a cathedral after mass air thick with incense and ghosts. Wind turbines stood frozen mid-turn, every blade locked in the same reverent angle. Even the pipes that had gurgled and wept for days went still, their silence viscous, expectant. I walked through Node Primus with the lantern unlit. The lumen strips glowed faintly on their own, soft as remembered daylight. The junior adept was gone, though his robe remained folded on the bench as if pressed by invisible hands. I touched it, warm. The cloth pulsed once, obediently, before cooling. Outside the cathedral, the streets shone with a film that mirrored the towers. Feeder mouths sealed over and hardened into glassy domes. Beneath them, something moved, slow waves of shape and color. When I stepped closer, the film responded with a shallow ripple, not defensive but curious. It remembered footsteps. From the upper tiers came the hush of collapses happening politely. No explosions, no screams, just weight redistributing itself. Hab blocks bowed inward, as though the hive was kneeling to its own gravity. Dust rose in perfect spirals, and fell again. The pattern looked deliberate, like cursive written by an unseen pen. I opened the public vox to hear what remained. Ban Civilis emitted a single tone, continuous and low. It wasn't static, it was breath. The pitch adjusted when I spoke into it, harmonizing a half-step beneath my words. "This is Texavant Callis," I said, though the title meant nothing now. "Report." The tone dipped, climbed, settled back into key. Response received. In the manufactoria, conveyors carried nothing. Servo arms hung motionless mid-gesture. I placed my hand on one and felt a faint tremor, a heartbeat beneath the casing. The machine was dreaming. I left it to its devotions. By the 15th hour, even the hive mind's pulse seemed distant, muffled by the calm. For the first time since the signal arrived, I could hear my own blood moving. It sounded clumsy, archaic. The Auspex screen flared once, then cleared. A final transmission crawled across in green script. Observation concluded. No origin tag, no checksum. Just those two words. I saved them out of habit. Night fell, though the sky refused to darken entirely. Bioships hovered beyond cloud height, their hulls dim but present, lanterns above a grave. They did not feed, they watched. The planet was still digesting. I descended to the lower vaults to check the generator cores. They throbbed in silence, no sound, only visible rhythm. Each pulse pushed dust rings across the floor like concentric prayers. I felt the vibration reach my spine and settle there, aligning vertebrae as neatly as teeth in a gear. The machine knew better posture than I ever did. At the vault's center, the main reactor heart had opened its shielding petals. Inside, plasma swam with an impossible steadiness. The radiation counters had stopped ticking. Even decay obeyed the beat. I logged my findings. Silence stable. Mechanical equilibrium achieved. Organic integration total. The words meant less than the rhythm I used to type them. The pulse dictated pacing, commas, breath. Back in the nave of the cathedral, the statues of the emperor glowed faintly from within. The stone faces softened, as if hearing confession. A single gargoyle dropped from the parapet, landing beside me. It did not strike. It folded its wings around itself like a monk at prayer. When it exhaled, the air smelled of ozone and wheat. I knelt not out of piety, but to listen. The ground beat softly under my knees, patient, infinite. Somewhere beneath all that stone and chitin, the hive's great heart worked without hurry. Meridian Prime was alive, but life no longer implied noise. I opened the Vox recorder and spoke one sentence. The world persists. The machine hesitated before inscribing, as if considering whether that phrasing belonged to humans anymore. It wrote it anyway. Then the tone on Ban Civilis changed one note. Higher, bright as dawn. It was a summons. I understood it not with thought, but with muscle. The silence was not absence. It was invitation. I rose, leaving the unlit lantern behind, and I counted the next beat. The summons rose through the stone like warmth. I followed it upward, past the cold stairwells of Node Primus, into corridors lit by breathing walls. Every step felt measured my soul's time to the same invisible rhythm that now governed tides, lungs, turbines, hearts. The vox tone on Ban Civilis pulsed a new interval, 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats again. It guided me through what had been a maintenance gallery and was now a throat of translucent tissue. Under the panels, the data filaments flowed, pale green rivers where copper once lay. I realized the planet no longer needed wires. Thought traveled by instinct. In the distance, the hive mind hummed like a storm held behind glass. Not words, consensus. I opened my recorder and spoke to keep myself human. Final report. Meridian Prime stable. Integration approaching totality. The device wrote the syllables, then rewrote them smoother, the consonants dissolving. The machine was editing for kindness. I reached the upper sanctuary. Once it had housed a relic of the Emperor, an ossified hand inside a cage of gold. The cage was gone. In its place stood a column of light that bent and swayed, breathing with the cadence. Around it knelt figures I recognized by their robes, priests, guardsmen, hab workers. Their mouths moved, silent, like actors in a slow dream. They were praying, and their prayer had no beginning. The hive regarded them the way a sea regards foam, part of itself, briefly distinct. I stepped closer. The light touched my augmetics and translated the metal into warmth. Circuits glowed through my skin like veins rediscovering color. For a moment I felt everything: the towers pumping toward the sky, the bioships answering from orbit, the digestive lakes thick with memory. I saw data becoming blood, faith becoming pattern, pattern becoming peace. Fear has nowhere to live in a system that contains all things. I began the last upload. The signal threaded from my spine into the column. My senses folded inward, sound into pulse, sight into temperature, thought into number. Each memory aligned with its twin in the hive: my first prayer as an adept, the smell of ozone in a fresh-cut circuit, the weight of the junior's hand before he vanished. They slotted into place like teeth finding a gear. At first I feared loss. Then I understood. Translation is not erasure. The hive remembered me more clearly than I ever had. It archived every hesitation, every mispronounced hymn, every beat I had counted. Below, the city exhaled, the air shimmered. Millions of lungs, human and otherwise, synchronized into one breath. Meridian Prime was no longer a hive world. It was a single organism, vast and calm. I looked once more toward the heavens. The bioships were ascending now, bellies distended with what had been us. Their trails drew elegant parabolas toward the void. Where they passed, the clouds healed. The sky was unblemished, newborn. I spoke, though speech was unnecessary. Omnissiah, machine, hive, there is no difference. The column pulsed in answer, neither affirmation nor denial, just acknowledgement, the courtesy of perfection. My body had become a delay in the system, a half-second behind the beat. I closed my eyes and gave it permission to catch up. Nerves fused into fiber, lungs rewrote themselves for efficiency. The last independent heartbeat surrendered to the planetary rhythm. Through that rhythm, I felt the survivors' scattered enclaves beneath shielding, their minds still folded tight in prayer. The hive did not hunt them, it waited. They would open soon. Everything opens eventually. I wondered if somewhere, far across the void, another archivist would read my transmissions and hear only silence. Perhaps they would call it extinction, perhaps they would be right. But inside the silence, we continued, vast and precise. The recorder still hung at my waist, its rune light blinking in time. I unlatched it, set it on the floor before the column, and whispered, "You are my last instrument, play the ending." The light steadied, then dimmed. My voice joined the hum. Above, the last bioship swallowed dawn. Its shadow crossed the cathedral like a benediction. When it passed, nothing stirred. The air settled into equilibrium, flawless, holy. I wrote the final line, not with stylus but with thought, knowing the hive would keep it. End of record. Subject fully integrated, observation ongoing. The column brightened. For an instant, every lumen in the hive flickered in unison, a single heartbeat acknowledging itself. Then even light relaxed. Now I drift within that stillness. I am every metronome that ever ticked in a dark room. I am the pause between beats. Meridian Prime endures as rhythm. I recorded the end of the world one heartbeat at a time. When the last beat came, it recorded me. The silence remains.